Hello everyone, and welcome to another video. I recently built a new computer, and if you've been following tech news, you'll know that there's a chip shortage. So I went to Canada Computers hoping to get a decently priced pre-built. But when they told me that they had a 3070 Ti in stock at MSRP, I knew that I had to find a way to get it. Long story short, I got myself an AMD Ryzen 5 5600X, a B550 board, 32GB of RAM, the 3070 Ti, and this. This mid-tower case from LEPA currently sells for a whopping $34.88. So let's check out how bad it is and whether it can handle a 5600X and a 3070 Ti. This video is sponsored by Keysoft. You might have the latest CPU and a fantastic GPU, but this annoying Activate Windows watermark will ruin the whole experience. And if you want to buy a key directly from Microsoft, you'll see that it costs upwards of $200 US. Keysoft currently has a Halloween promotion where you can get a Windows 10 professional key for less than $11 US. Just use the code KPA30 at checkout. You'll get your key within minutes and you can pay with PayPal. Links in the description. I bought this case without doing any research. I was sold the moment the rep told me that it cost $35. I'd never heard of LEPA Tech before, but apparently they make cases and power supplies. Their website is straight out of 2000s, they still use Adobe Flash. Nostalgia aside, you have access to all the information you need. Just for fun, let's have a quick look at the product page of the Corsair Carbide 275R. Sure, it looks great, but where are my dimensions? Where are my ports? How hard is it to include those numbers? I needed to make sure that a 3070 Ti would fit in this case, and overall it took me less than 1 minute to figure that out. Anyways, let's talk about the case. First things first, it's light. It only weighs around 3 kilograms. For comparison, a Corsair 275R weighs twice as much. Once you open the box, you get the case, some screws, and a user manual. The case itself, just like LEPA's website, is nostalgic. It's been a while since I last saw a case without a Windows side panel. There are some blue accents in front, which by the way is an advanced feature. In terms of front I/O, we have a USB 2.0 port, a USB 3.0 port, and separate jacks for headphones and microphones. You also get a power button as well as a restart button. I like that they included a USB 3.0 port, but I'm not sure why they chose to put them upside down. Why? Still, I don't hate its design. There are two 5.25-inch slots for optical drives, which adds to the nostalgia. On the plus side, they went for a mesh panel in front to help increase the airflow. There are so many expensive cases out there with virtually zero airflow in front. On the side, as I mentioned, we don't have a window. Instead, there is a grill where you can install two 120mm fans. There is nothing exciting on the back, and on top, well, there's nothing on top. We'll talk about thermals later, but I think a top grill would really help its airflow. Quick note, apparently there is a version with a top grill. Also, this deep scratch on top is completely my mistake and has nothing to do with build quality. There's a dust filter on the bottom for a power supply, but frankly, this is the cheapest filter that I've ever seen in my life. Better than nothing, I guess. Speaking of quality, the build quality is well above its price. There are no sharp corners and the measurement tolerances are acceptable. I had no issues building a computer in this case. Except one thing that brings us to material quality. I mentioned that it's quite light, which means that the frame is quite thin. This shouldn't be an issue and isn't, except for the PCI holders. While building in this case, I accidentally ended up bending this holder. I wasn't rough or anything. Fortunately, I was able to bend it back and I managed to install a GPU without any issues. That was the only issue I had with this case. As there isn't a separate compartment for the power supply and the hard drives, installing components into this case is very easy. Although we pretty much all switched to NVMe drives for our boot drives, hard drives are still a thing because of games and other stuff. Most new cases have hard drive trays next to the power supply, but if your power supply is too big, you will need to take that tray off. Again, this is my personal preference, but I love the layout of this case. I don't have an optical drive because why would I? But there are 2 optical drive slots if you need them. There are 3 hard drive slots, and as someone who has 2 hard drives, I love it. There are also 4 2.5-inch slots that you can remove if your GPU is too large. My 3070 Ti fit in there just fine, so I didn't have to remove it. Mine came with 1 fan installed by default, and I immediately installed 2 more to increase airflow. Taking off the front panel is quite easy. There's a handle on the bottom. Pull it and the front panel will come off. Just make sure you don't pull it too hard so you won't break the clips or the front panel connections. You can technically install two 120mm fans here, but you need these special screws. The problem is that there is only 4 of them in the box. So you either install one fan or you skip some screws to install 2. That's what I did. Cable management is possible, but 1, as there is no power supply compartment, there will be some loose cables, and 2, as there is no Windows side panel, it's not really necessary. So you don't need to do your best. Anyways, once everything is done, push the super high quality power button and everything will come to life. I checked all the front I/O ports and they all work perfectly fine. As per thermals, my 5600X with the stock cooler idles around 49 degrees, which is pretty much where it's supposed to be. The 3070 Ti idles at around 45 degrees, which again is normal. In order to test out the thermals, we're gonna stress test the CPU and the GPU separately and measure their thermals. We'll then stress test them both and see how big of a difference there is. To ensure that all tests are fair, we will make sure that the same background processes are running in all tests and that the ambient temperatures are the same. We have 3 scenarios: closed case, open case, and an ideal scenario. We first start with a 10-minute Cinebench R23 test. In all 3 scenarios, we see a quick temperature jump to 75 degrees. Closed case setup maxes out at 82 degrees, while the ideal scenario stays at 81. What's interesting though is that the open case scenario maxes out at 83.4 degrees. To me, this means that there is a decent airflow in this case. Cinebench results confirm this. In the closed case setup, we managed to get 10,305 points. The ideal situation yielded 10,366 points, while the open case scenario got less than 10,300. The scores are close to one another, but I ran these tests multiple times to ensure that they were accurate. The GPU temperature stayed constant in our closed case setup, while it went down in the ideal situation. Interestingly, the temps went up during the open case test. We won't be using Cinebench for our stress test though. Instead, we will be using Furmark and CPU-Z. Let's check out the CPU temperature during a 10-minute CPU-Z stress test. Once again, temperatures quickly go up to 72 degrees at first. Our closed case setup settles at around 83.5 degrees, while the ideal scenario does so at around 82.5. So we see a 1 degree difference again. On the other hand, the open case setup settles at around 84.5 degrees. This confirms that the airflow in our case works well. GPU temperatures in this test are very similar to Cinebench. In the ideal airflow scenario, the GPU temperature drops by 8 degrees, while we only see a 2 degree reduction in the closed case scenario. And if we remove the side panel, we see that the temperature increases by around a degree. I would say that it's not a good idea to remove the side panel of this case, but things will soon take a sharp turn. GPU temperatures under load were the same regardless of whether I ran a CPU test or not, so I'm gonna skip that. When we run a CPU-Z stress test and a Furmark GPU stress test at the same time, we see interesting results. In our regular closed case setup, the CPU temperature quickly goes up to 74 degrees and keeps increasing up to 93 degrees. While 74 degrees for a 3070 Ti isn't unheard of, the CPU temperature is quite high. The maximum CPU temperature in the previous test was 83 degrees, so there's a 10 degree increase. The old taking off the side panel method somewhat works here, as the CPU temperature stayed at a relatively low 90 degrees, while the GPU stayed at around 67 degrees. So we get a 3 degree difference in CPU temps and an 8 degree difference in GPU. Our ideal airflow scenario does even better, as the CPU stays at a cool 83 degrees, while the GPU settles at around 67 degrees. This makes sense from a scientific standpoint. Warm air rises, and as a result, the hot air coming from the GPU goes to the CPU. If we had a top grill, some of that air would have escaped. However, as we don't have one, we have to rely on the fans and the airflow created by them to exhaust that hot air. Let's talk about increasing the airflow in this case. While it seems to be enough for the CPU alone, when the GPU comes into play, things take a sharp turn. What if I tell you that a CPU cooler can solve this problem? My go-to CPU cooler is a Noctua NH-D15, but it's overkill for a 5600X. Instead, I bought this V-True V5 cooler from Amazon for a whopping $37.99. I'll do a separate video about that cooler, but all I can say right now is that it's a great value. This cooler comes with one fan, but I had another 120mm lying around from my old Cooler Master Hyper T4 cooler, so I used that one too. So I currently have 3 case fans and 2 CPU cooler fans installed in this case. Even before we run any benchmarks, we can see the difference in temperature. Our CPU now idles at around 38 degrees, while the GPU idles at around 35. Our 10-minute Cinebench R23 run shows a great difference in temperature. Even in the ideal scenario, the CPU would reach 81 degrees with the stock cooler. With the aftermarket cooler, we max out at around 64.5 degrees. This obviously has an effect on our Cinebench score. The best we could get with the stock cooler was 10,366. With this aftermarket cooler, we managed to get 10,923 points, which is a 5% increase. Although not as much as the ideal scenario, we see a reduction in GPU temperature. This is because the CPU cooler fans are spinning harder, creating more airflow. We see a similar story in CPU-Z. During a CPU-Z stress test, our CPU stays 15 to 20 degrees cooler than before. Interestingly, we don't see a significant reduction in GPU temperature, but it doesn't increase either. Things become really interesting when we run the CPU-GPU combined stress test again. Once again, our CPU stays 10 to 20 degrees cooler under load with this new cooler. Moreover, the GPU temperature curve is very similar to an open case scenario. If you don't want to invest in a CPU cooler, you could potentially get some case fans for cheap from Amazon. The problem with that is that we did all our testing assuming that there are 3 fans in the case. Yes, you can install 2 fans to the side panel, but I'm not sure whether you'd want to do that. Not even considering the fact that those fans might touch your CPU cooler, your power supply, or your GPU. Should you buy this case? It totally depends. It's clear that this case doesn't want to compete with more expensive models. So if you're in the market for a Fantex P400A, this isn't the case for you. But if you're the kind of person who would rather spend more money on performance than aesthetics, then this might be a good value for you. Alternatively, if you're the kind of person who wouldn't mind buying a gaming PC from Dell, this case is perfect for you. When it comes to building your own PC, airflow and case design are very important. However, most pre-built gaming desktops ship with stock coolers and cases with no top grills. Regardless of whether you want to go AMD or Intel, you will most probably want to buy a CPU cooler anyway. I mean, look at this Raid Stealth that my 5600X shipped with. You saw the temperatures. Overall, as is, I'd say that this is a great case for a Ryzen 5 5600G and no GPU. You won't need a top grill, and the included 120mm fan will be enough to cool down your components. You will need to buy a CPU cooler and some extra fans to cool down your higher-end components, but arguably you would also need to do that if you bought an expensive case. I had a Corsair 275R and I had to buy a CPU cooler and a bunch of extra fans to keep my components cool. I ended up doing the same for this case. What I'm trying to say is that if you're trying to save some money by getting a cheaper case, this is a good option. I still wish it had a top grill though. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider liking this video, checking out my other videos, and subscribing to my channel. Take care.